Good evening and welcome to Sankofa Moments, a collaboration of the Religious Affairs Committee and Education committees of the Virginia NAACP. Thank you so much for joining us. It is still Black History Month. As a matter of fact, we celebrate our Black history every day, 365 days of the year. Sankofa Moments is birthed out of just that, a celebration of our Black history and us sharing our history and telling our story correctly. I have with me tonight Dr. Amy Tillerson-Brown, and she is going to share with us, starting with a backdrop of the Virginia NAACP, and take us through a certain time period. And then, to keep your interest, she will be continuing this series as we lead up to our 90th celebration. If you have questions, I would ask that you place them in the chat, and we will be monitoring that chat as we go forward tonight. Dr. Amy Tillerson-Brown, thank you so much, and the microphone is yours.
Absolutely. Thank all of you for being here this evening. I am happy to be here on this almost end of Black History Month, but as Reverend Dr. Lee said, we celebrate Black history every day of the year. I want to talk for a bit. This is a thread that we can use to pull through subsequent Sankofa moments, the early years of the Virginia State Conference of the NAACP, Why We Fight. Next slide, please. The color line that W.E.B. Du Bois noted would be the problem of the 20th century effectively separated Blacks from whites in Virginia. However, Blacks used to work within the constraints of that Jim Crow system to resist oppression and to build their communities. Du Bois wrote in Souls of Black Folk, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. How Blacks and whites would create an America without the peculiar institution of slavery became the problem of the century, and Black Americans often bore the burden. Despite this, Black communities came together to realize their humanity by any means necessary, even alongside Jim Crow. Jim Crow originated as a minstrel character performed by a white actor, Thomas D. Rice, in the 1830s. We can go to the next slide. Rice claimed that he witnessed an elderly enslaved African in Louisville, Kentucky, singing Jump Jim Crow. In popular fashion, Rice imitated, better yet, appropriated the Black man's words and exaggerated his mannerisms to fit stereotypical imaginations of his white audiences and gained stardom performing minstrel routines in blackface as Jim Crow. You can change the slide. He would tell jokes and sing songs in his interpretation of slave dialect. One popular refrain was, wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. So by the turn of the 20th century, this Jim Crow as a character was phasing out. And what Jim Crow came to represent was a racial caste system that was enabled by anti-Black laws that had emerged after Reconstruction as an affront to Black progress and a means to exact control over Black bodies. The Plessy decision ruled that separate was equal, but we know that that wasn't the case. We know that that Plessy decision basically sanctioned American apartheid. Nearly 40 years after the Dred Scott decision that claimed that the Black man has no rights, that the white man is bound to respect, the Plessy decision, there again, it came to sanction American apartheid. Now, Jim Crow phrase itself conjures up a variety of feelings and understandings. For some, the phrase is synonymous with segregation and references to a time when Blacks and whites simply lived separately. They understand Jim Crow or segregation as a time where Blacks and whites didn't use the same facilities or attend the same schools and churches. And this understanding often suggests that Blacks and whites, for the most part, got along. Some forged friendships. Separation of the races was simply just the way that it was, pretty much benign. But for others, Jim Crow conjures up feelings of terror because of their understandings of what the former group calls segregation were more aptly referred to as American apartheid. By the end of 1902, universal male suffrage that had been promised by the 15th Amendment meant little for Blacks in Virginia, as the new Constitution allowed for poll taxes, literacy tests, and rendered thousands of Black men ineligible to vote. With no political power, Blacks in the Commonwealth and all over the South were left to the goodwill of whites to receive any semblance of justice. And we know about those Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, the 13th that says there's no involuntary servitude unless you're a criminal, right? The 14th that grants citizenship with due process of law and equal protection under the law to everyone except Indians, and the 15th Amendment that granted universal male suffrage. All right. In Virginia, however, and when you're thinking about that 13th Amendment that said there's no involuntary servitude except criminals, that leads us to this next slide, right? Because if you had been convicted of a crime, then it was legal to exact involuntary servitude from you. In Virginia, most convicts were leased to railroads, quarries, and the James River and Kanawha Canal Company. This work was grueling, and considered the low cost of leasing, managers were not concerned with whether or not these people were being treated humanely. In 1881, the death rate of convicts in leasing camps in Richmond and in the Allegheny Railroad was 7 times higher than the death rate for inmates inside the Richmond Penitentiary. With Virginia's 1906 State Highway Commission, most of her convicts worked on Virginia's roads as members of the chain gang. It's also important to note that misdemeanor crimes could land one on the chain gang, whereas convict leasing of previous generations was typically reserved for felons. More misdemeanors, more labor. As the name suggests, convicts on the chain gang were forced to build roads, dig ditches, or farm while chained together. This cut down the cost of guarding prisoners, but it also left them susceptible to infections from the shackles and prevented some from getting away from violent or sick prisoners. Lynchings were violent and public acts of torture that traumatized Black people throughout the country and were largely tolerated by state and federal officials. We can go to the next slide. These lynchings were of terrorism. Oh my, I see it there, good. From about 1871 to 1932, there were about 105 documented lynchings in the state of Virginia. Mob violence was a regular reaction of whites wishing to exact power and their form of justice. Black men were typically murdered. Black men were those who were typically murdered, but Charlotte Harris was a Black woman and Peb Falls, a white woman, who were both lynched in Rockingham County, Virginia, in 1878 and 1897, respectively. A mob of men with blackened faces took Miss Harris from a Harrisonburg jail, hanged her from a tree for allegedly burning a barn. There were other lynchings that went on in Virginia as well. So this Jim Crow era was not benign or easy at all. Another thing that originators of this Virginia State Conference of the NAACP were dealing with was the unfair housing in the 1930s. Redlining was a big deal. So it's no surprise then, but that by 1935, Sadie White of Suffolk, Oliver Hill of Richmond, Jesse Tinsley of Richmond, Jewel Carrington of Halifax, Zenobia Gilpin of Richmond, Jay Hopkins of Richmond, Dr. Leon Ramson of the National Office, and Mrs. Spencer of Roanoke met in 1935 in Roanoke, Virginia, to organize the Virginia State Conference of the NAACP. In the early years, the legal staff consisted of Oliver W. Hill, Martin A. Martin, Samuel Tucker, Edwin Brown Sr., Spotswood Robinson III, Robert Cooley Jr., Roland Ely, Philip Walker, Reuben Lawson, W. Hale Thompson, and Victor Ashe. I called the name in part of that legal counsel of Samuel Tucker. And before he started to work with the Virginia State Conference directly, he was a 26-year-old in Alexandria, Virginia, who in August 1939 staged a sit-in of the segregated public library in Alexandria. Later, that public library was named the Kate Waller branch of the Kate Waller Barrett Branch Library. So Tucker and a retired Army Sergeant, George Wilson, had attempted earlier that year to secure a library card, and they were told that coloreds in quotation marks, could not get library cards. So Tucker filed a lawsuit on behalf of Wilson, and he argued that taxes paid by Black citizens helped to operate the library, so Blacks had the right to use the facilities. Corporation Circuit Judge William Wools held off on his ruling to give the city and the library time to solve the issue. Tucker chose the direct action route, so he recruited 5 gentlemen, including his brother, Otto Tucker, to come. And they were all young. They were all between the ages of 18 and 22. And they were to enter this segregated library one by one, well-dressed, to ask to apply for library cards. They knew that they weren't going to get them, but they had a plan for these men to go into the library and sit in different places and peacefully just read. This happened 20 years before the Greensboro sit-ins of 1960. As anticipated, these peaceful protesters were arrested. We can go to the next slide, I'm sorry. Yes, these peaceful protesters were arrested. Ultimately, their charge was that of disorderly conduct. And what Tucker claimed in defending them was the only reason they were labeled disorderly was because they were Black. So this lawsuit on behalf of Sergeant George Wilson proceeded in Judge Wool's court, and he finally ruled in 1940. There was a split decision, and he had denied Wilson's petition for a library card. So they lost this case on a technicality. The court had determined that Wilson did not fill out his own library card application, and so it wasn't granted. However, Judge Wool's also ruled that the law was on their side. The sit-in participants who had sat in at this were also arrested. And it wasn't until 2019 that the Alexandria Circuit Court dismissed all of these charges against the participants of the 1939 sit-in. The Tuckers were central to this protest, but teacher equalization of salaries was the next cause that was taken up by the Virginia State Conference of the NAACP. They worked collaboratively with the Virginia Teachers Association because they believed that Black teachers should be receiving salaries similar or equal to those of their white counterparts. So in 1939, Black female teachers in the western part of our state, Stanton, Virginia, earned $653 annually, while white females earned $1,081 annually. Black men earned $742 per year, and white men earned $1,556 per year. We can change the next slide. So Aileen Black and Melvin Alston were fighting for equalized teacher salaries out of Norfolk, Virginia. And what they were doing did not go unnoticed. In 1940, federal courts ruled that Norfolk public schools had to pay Black and white teachers the same pay scales. So you had Black teachers in other parts of the state. I'm on Stanton, so I'll stay there. The Black teachers in Stanton were members of the Negro Teachers Association, and they had petitioned the school board to go ahead and pay those equal salaries to Blacks and whites because of the legislation that had already come through, largely in part to the, due in part to the work of the NAACP lawyers. Well, Stanton was a tough nut to crack, so to speak. And Black teacher, ultimately, the board didn't equalize teacher salaries despite the Alston ruling. Instead, they passed a wordy resolution that allowed Black teacher reemployment at $10 per month increase. Well, that got the attention of Oliver Hill, and he wrote the board supporting the Black teachers. Now, in Stanton fashion, the board fired back a letter letting Hill know that they would not be swayed by outside agitators, and that in keeping with the laws of the governing board, they would basically do whatever they wanted, including paying Black teachers unfairly. They weren't concerned with equity then, but the NAACP continued to fight. So you kept that agitation going up. They had already won the Supreme Court case. Now they had to go around and make sure that these local districts were complying. I'm looking at my time and I'm almost at 20 minutes, but I want us to look towards what we might be talking about next time. Before Rosa Parks, Irene Morgan refused to give up a seat. And this happened right here in Virginia. Maybe we can talk about that. And then, of course, what we all know Virginia for is the Brown decisions, Brown 1, Brown 2, right? Massive resistance. And then by 68, New Kent County. But along the way, we'll find there were a lot of Virginia activists that were working to realize the mission of the NAACP. And that activism had not gone unnoticed by those who decided that we needed a state conference here in Virginia to make sure that racial equity, equality, and justice were being served in our fine Commonwealth. So I'm going to stop talking and ask if there are any questions. It did. It sure did. Yes, Irene Morgan's story did begin there. I believe she was from Baltimore and she's writing, and it begins right there. And see, these are stories that we hope through these Sankofa moments we can highlight and then also bring to the fore the work that our state conference has been doing along the way. Yes. Oh, is there a question here?
Dr. Tillerson-Brown, there is a question in the Q&A, and perhaps you're familiar with this, but the question is, why does the NAACP still leave out one of the founders in the early 1900s? His name is Waller L. White. Are you familiar?
I'm familiar, very familiar with Walter White. And he was a champion in the NAACP, the national scene. He was a very fair complected man. And so his ability to pass, I'm sure we all know about that phenomena of passing, right? Was both a blessing and a curse. He tells of how he was going to Elaine, Arkansas, to find out more about a lynching that had occurred there after sharecroppers had come together to protest their poor salaries and poor treatment. And while he was writing, the whites did not detect that he was actually African descended. And they were talking about lynching a yellow guy, yellow, slang for yellow, right? Who was coming around posing as white. And he got out just in the nick of time. But he was a forerunner, Walter White was, of the NAACP. He and W.B. Du Bois often, as time progressed, their heads butt over several issues. A key among them was that of whether or not segregation was the best thing for African Americans or not. But he was definitely a force within the national NAACP in particular, and he was quite dedicated to fighting for justice, even if it meant putting his own body on the line. So yes, he is definitely a forerunner, in particular of the national NAACP. He was from Georgia, though. He was born in Georgia, but he didn't stay there. He ended up migrating up north, as did so many of his counterparts during that great migration time period that he came of age.
Thank you for that.
And I was trying to focus on Virginia, so I didn't bring him up, but definitely someone to remember when we think about our organization's rich history. And any other questions or comments? why has so little been said about female lynchings? You know, that's a very, very good question. Females were lynched. Gosh, I think this could almost be a topic in and of itself, right? And why the assumption was that, you know, why is it when in an era when we're thinking about the turn of the 20th century, when chivalry was supposed to be at its heights, right? And we're following these Victorian eras of social ideals and mores. How is it that a great Southern gentleman could lynch a woman, right? Doesn't that run counter to this idea of chivalry? Yet we know that lynchings of women happened. There were two women from Rockingham, one Black and one white, that I was going to start elaborating on. But one of the most grotesque lynching cases was that of Hayes Turner and his wife. Hayes Turner had gone to vote. And of course, that wasn't in keeping with the ideals of the day, social ideals of the day, and he was lynched. And his wife had the audacity to say that she was going to exact justice. She was going to make sure she's going to swear out a warrant, and she was going to use the law to get justice for her husband. Well, what this vigilante mob of whites did was captured Mary Turner, and lynched her, they say, in a very grotesque way from her ankle. She happened to be 9 months pregnant. They cut her belly and stomped the child to death. Gruesome. There was no chivalry as it applied to Black women, especially when lynching was at its height. Which could lead us to a great discussion of intersectionality too, but we won't do that tonight. Yeah.
Mm.
I see a raised hand. If you could just go ahead and place your comment or your question in the chat or in the Q&A.
Did the first interracial marriage happen in Virginia? Well, we got the legalization of interracial marriage coming right out of Caroline County, Virginia, right? Yeah, and that's not until 1967. You know, so that's like not too long ago that the state of Virginia decided to say, you know, what was the name of the book by Peter Wallace? I Tell the Courts I Love My Wife, right? And what the oh goodness, how did the name just go out of my head? You all don't get old. Lovings. What they had done was left Caroline County and gone to Washington, D.C., where they thought they could legally be wed, right? And then they came back to Caroline County, and that's where their trouble started. Because in what local officials there believed was that you could not be married and one person be Black and white in the state of Virginia. And that's what sent them on this long, treacherous legal journey. And by 1967, the Supreme Court finally did rule that miscegenation should be stricken from our rolls. I saw another question, and that it would be legal. Interracial marriage would then be legal. I could have sworn I saw a question coming up, but maybe I'm seeing things.
I'm just going back through the chats.
And so you took us to about 1939?
Yeah, 1939, 1940. Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe we can pick up Irene Morgan next time. Her story is quite interesting.
I was just going to give them prelude for the next Sankofa moment, which will come up on the second Tuesday in March, that we will start where we left off and continue there. We are coming up to close to the 7:30 hour. We could take on a few more questions if we have them.
That people were and are so against a group of people who only want to live and be free. Oh, goodness. Love that question. I'm teaching a class right now on the history of race and racism. And so, you know, I'm thinking, how do I answer this question in 3 minutes, right? Because we can go so far back to how this hate, these racist ideas and how they've been justified over time. I think the simple answer is that we know that race has been socially constructed, but has very, very lasting implications, right? We know it's a social construct, but it definitely means something, and your treatment is varied based on the race of an individual, which is why the NAACP was founded to fight so hard for racial justice. But what I have concluded is that in this wonderful country that we live in right now, it was necessary to create race as a caste, a category, so as to support and propel the Atlantic slave trade, which built the economy of the nation that we now reside in. And in keeping that, over time, we see how even after slavery, right, those racial tenets that people had bought into, hook, line, and sinker, did not disappear. And that's one reason we needed organizations like the National NAACP, like the Virginia NAACP, to make sure that the promises of the 14th Amendment were made available to everyone, regardless of race. And that's why we must continue this fight, because we're not yet post-racial. Yeah. So basically, why do people so intently hate different groups? Because to accept them as equals would, I think, then challenge and question the identities that had been created and supported of folk who were not minority to occupy a certain position of power. And when you get rid of that, then we get to see the world for what it actually is, without those contrived restrictions and parameters. W.B. Du Bois. I don't think it's Du Bois, if that's what you're, W.E.B. Du Bois. William Edward Beauregard Du Bois. The question. Are we talking about local elections for that question? Why are there not any excitement or enthusiasm over the political atmosphere for motivating younger, happier candidates? It seems like we picked the same candidates during elections. I get exactly why you say that. But I'm afraid to start talking about it because I feel like I'm going to go too far past 7:30. Yeah. But if that's a topic of interest, we can definitely talk about the role of the Republican and Democratic Party over time, and when we can go from Reconstruction up probably in one session. As we know, at Reconstruction, most Blacks that were voting due to the Reconstruction amendments were voting the Republican ticket. And it's not until FDR that we see that switch. And then you see the resurgence in the 1940s of the Dixiecrats, right? Then to me, yeah, that might be a good topic to investigate further down the road, because at this point, what you have to often have young activists pleading for is to see a real difference between Republicans and Democrats. It's almost like you're choosing the same old song. And there is a reason that has happened as well. And I'd love to get into it at some other time. Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think a goal of ours is to make sure that we touch some of these local places so that we can see the Virginia State Conference is there to kind of be a spokesman for these local and regional branches as well. So the more we know about the activism that's going on locally, then we can, I think that we can tell a much richer story of activism in our state. Yeah. With so much interracial dating and marriage, why do you think that we are not? I missed the end of it.
It says, why do you not think we're not in a better place when it comes to race relationships?
Well, I think to answer that question, we really need to think about why was there a necessity to create a Black and white race in the first place? And we know that marriage is kind of on the periphery. It's important, but it wasn't the central reason that these races were created. I can't answer, I don't think anyone can effectively answer that question without getting into the role that capitalism, greed, money plays with why these caste systems are required to sustain a certain hierarchy, place on the hierarchy for whites and a certain place on the hierarchy for non-white. Yeah, so that's a very big question, a very good question. And there's so many avenues that I think we could go down to answer that question. But the first one I would look at would be economy, capitalism. Why do we need that? You might remember the documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, that had compiled lots of James Baldwin quotes and a lot of his experiences. And what James Baldwin at the end of that documentary encourages us to think about is why did you need we'll just say Negro, why was that important for that to have been created? And when we get at the answers of that, I think that the role of money, wealth, are going to be key among some of the top answers. Okay.
So it doesn't appear, Dr. Tillerson-Brown, that we have any additional questions.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope that we can see you next month.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.